By the end of 1944, to break the German Nazi war economy and will to fight, the RAF and USAAF have spent tens of thousands of their own airmen's lives and that of a few 100,000 German civilians, Allied POW and slaves held by the Nazis. It has neither achieved the goal to break the economy nor shattered the Germans' will to fight. If anything, it has continuously strengthened public calls in Germany for Hitler and his henchmen to exact revenge on the British population, which they have tried with very limited success. The Nazi war-producing economy has only increased its pace, as if the bombs and climbing civilian death toll were little more than nuisances. Now, at the end of 1944, something changes, though, and the Allied combined bomber offensive begins to take effect. Will it make a difference at this late point in the war? And is it worth the cost? I'm Spartacus Olsson. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. If I told you that the year 1944 is the most productive year of the war for the German arms industry, you might find it a bit hard to believe. The country is suffering under a rain of bombs, losing territory and resources across Europe, and sending hundreds of thousands of workers to the front. So what's the secret? And why is it not enough to beat the bombs in December 1944? Okay, so Reich Armaments Minister Albert Speer spends the first half of 1944 feeling very pleased with himself. At conferences and meetings, he's always keen to display his production charts, and it certainly looks like he has done amazing things. Hans Kerl, the chief of planning of the ministry, keeps a monthly index of German arms production. From a figure of 230 in February, the armaments index spikes to a height of 330 in July 1944. In the summer of 44, even as the Allies chip away at the frontiers of the Reich, the German war industry economy has never been more productive. Speer accepts the praise from the Führer, poses in the propaganda newsreels, and tours the factories to inspire the workers. He firmly believes that his reforms will drive the Reich to final victory. 2/3 of this surge comes from the aircraft industry. Both Indy and I have covered the near defeat of the Luftwaffe in early 1944 as production could not keep up with losses. After blocking attempts to increase fighter production in favor of his precious vengeance weapons, Hitler finally authorizes the formation of the Jägerstab, or fighter staff, in March 1944, which brings together the Luftwaffe's Erhard Milch with Albert Speer and Karl Otto Sauer of the Armaments Ministry. This appears to bring near-instant results. In February 1944, Germany produces just 1,323 aircraft, but this rises to 3,538 in September, of which almost 2,900 are fighters. In total, over 40,000 aircraft will be produced by the end of this year, about 1.5 times the figure in 1943. Even after the war is over, Speer will continue to trumpet his last surge in fighter production as his greatest achievement. In books, interviews, television appearances, he will make his case to a fascinated Western audience. Speer's explanation is simple. After being appointed to his post in February 1942, shortly after the failure in the Battle of Moscow, his ministry absorbed ever more of the German war economy. First the army and the railways, then the Panzer program, then the U-boat program, and finally the Luftwaffe. Speer will explain that he rationalized the industry, introduced new, more efficient methods of work, and reallocated more coal to steel production. All the while, he and his allies have managed to release hundreds of thousands of German workers from industry, put them into uniform, and send them to the front. Those who remain behind work 70 hours a week in return for pay bonuses and extra rations of food, sweets, cigarettes, alcohol, and clothes. Speer has also been at the forefront of pressing women into the workforce. By October 44, 35% of the 6.2 million people employed in the arms industry are women. But this is only part of the story. As we've spoken about before, Speer's system relies on millions of foreign workers. This number soars in 1944, and by August there are over 7.6 million, one-fifth of the labor force. These workers are subdivided into categories. At the top are guest workers from Germany's allies and neutral countries. They earn the same as German citizens and enjoy most of the same freedoms. But these privileged workers represent only about 1% of the workforce. The other 99% are forced laborers or slaves. About 1.7 million of these are ethnic Poles rounded up and deported from the Generalgouvernement. They work longer hours, 7 days a week, with no holidays, and receive lower wages and food rations. Another 2 million are prisoners of war. British and American prisoners are at least generally treated in accordance with the rules of war, but Soviet POW are treated as if the Geneva Conventions don't apply to them. Then there are about 3 million or so Ostarbeiter taken from Soviet territories. They wear a badge marked with the word Ost and live under armed guard. More than any other class of civilian workers, they are exposed to the arbitrary cruelty of the SS and Gestapo. The drive for fighter production finally leads the Nazis to break their strongest racial taboo. Within weeks of the German occupation of Hungary in March 1944, the Jägerstab is discussing how to make use of the country's Jews. As I discussed in my episode on Hungary, most of Hungary's Jews are deported and murdered at Auschwitz. But after discussions with Eichmann, tens of thousands of Jews are pressed into Luftwaffe production service. Conditions are miserable, and the Nazis still intend to eventually murder every Jew in Europe. But for some, it is a life-saving adjustment of policy. About 120,000 Hungarian Jews will survive the war as laborers. I'll speak more about this whole situation in an episode on the German camp system. Now, the ultimate manifestation of Speer's alliance with Himmler and the SS is the vast underground factory, the Mittelwerk. Air Force laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora camp complex work to build V-2 rockets and engines for the Me-262 jet fighter. As of the end of 1944, only about 1,500 Jews work in the Mittelbau-Dora camp complex, although that number will surge in early 1945. About 60,000 people pass through the system, and the conditions are horrendous. Inmates work 12-hour days, breathe in noxious fumes, sleep in the tunnels, are deprived of food, water, and sanitation, and see sunlight just once a week. Unsurprisingly, the Mittelwerk is deadly. It claims 20,000 lives. Despite his post-war claims to be largely unaware of the brutalities of the Nazi system and of the Holocaust, Speer himself visits the plant at least once, while V2 mastermind Werner von Braun makes at least 10 visits. But is all this death and misery enough? Will the Luftwaffe wrest back control of the skies? Will the arms industry feed a final victory for the Reich? Well, sitting here in December 1944, I can give you the answer. No. But what happens? Let's look at the Luftwaffe first. Without understanding the failure of the Air Force, we cannot understand the breaking of the German economy as 1944 turns to 1945. The real final death of the Luftwaffe begins shortly after Big Week, when Karl Spaatz, the head of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, starts the oil campaign. The goal, to starve the Wehrmacht of fuel. In April, the Spaatz bombers hit the Romanian oil refineries at Ploiești. He follows this up with more attacks against refineries, synthetic production plants, storage sites, and oil transportation targets in Romania, Italy, Hungary, Austria, and Germany itself. Production of aviation fuel declines from 180,000 tons in March to a low of below 25,000 tons in August. That figure will never rise again above 50,000 tons. The shortage of fuel severely constrains training. By the end of 1944, a German pilot receives just 60 to 80 hours of operational training compared to 225 for an RAF pilot. Not only does this increase combat losses, which are already over 20% per month by March 44, but it also means that an enormous number of aircraft are lost in non-combat incidents. Those losses only add to the attrition cycle. The oil targets are so vital that the Luftwaffe must send fighters up to defend them. Fighters that are preyed upon by the ever-growing fleet of Allied long-range fighters like the P-51 and P-38. This all builds on huge German losses suffered during Big Week in February and during the Defense Against the Transportation Plan. That's the RAF and US AAF bombing of infrastructure in France and in the Low Countries in preparation for D-Day. These losses are entirely unsustainable. In the 6-month period from January to June 1944, Germany loses 137% of its aircraft strength. 9,867 planes, 6,259 are lost in combat, but over half that number, 3,608, are lost outside of combat. If we look at the fighter force alone, those numbers are even worse. They lose 251% of their strength in the same period, 2,855 in combat and 1,345 outside of combat. All of Speer's increased production is eaten up by these losses. German frontline fighter strength hardly changes over the course of the year, sitting at 1,600 in January and 1,610 in September 44. Meanwhile, thanks to the production might of the American war industry, the Allies are able to assemble vast fleets of fighters and bombers. In Western Europe, if we count the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, the medium bombers of the 9th Air Force, and their fighters, the Americans, have 2,528 aircraft in January 1944 and over 3,000 aircraft in June 1944. That's leaving aside the 15th Air Force operating out of Italy. The long and short of this is that by summer, the Allies have air superiority. In September 44, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower releases his air forces from the task of supporting the ground forces in Western Europe. Head of RAF Bomber Command Arthur Harris and Spaatz are both keen to restart the combined bomber offensive. Spaatz tells Harris in September that the Hun has still got a lot of fight left in him. We must concentrate to kill him off. But there's still debate as to how to do this. And naturally, Spaatz wants to continue the oil campaign, as does 8th Air Force Chief James Doolittle. Arthur Tedder and British government bombing advisor Solly Zuckerman wants to focus on transportation targets in Germany. Harris is no fan of either option. He believes that by smashing German cities, his bombers can spare the ground forces from a costly final assault on the Reich. Already, Harris has begun hitting medium-sized German cities, which have so far been spared. On the night of September 11th, 226 Lancasters head to Darmstadt, population of about 120,000. Darmstadt lacks any major industrial centers, and the RAF justified it as an attack on the railway network. Clear weather and good marking by the Mosquito Pathfinder aircraft results in near destruction of the city center and surrounding residential zones. 8,400 people are reported dead, although this figure could be as high as 12,000, and at least 50,000 are left homeless. All the while, Harris is drawing up plans for a mission codenamed Thunderclap, which calls for 2,000 tons of bombs to be dropped in a 2.5 square mile area of central Berlin. The aim is to shatter German morale by the obliteration of the visible signs of an organized government and force the Nazi regime to surrender. Harris's talk creates great unease in the American half of the coalition. A meeting is held on October 28th for SHAEF to discuss the way forward. The result is Directive No. 2, issued on November 1st, which places highest priority on oil and transport targets. Harris reacts furiously. When he receives the order, he scribbles in the margins, "Here we go around the mulberry bush again." Despite this, and his angry complaints to Charles Portal, Harris does increase Bomber Command's targeting of oil facilities. This rises from 6% of total tonnage to 24%, still behind the American 8th and 15th Air Forces, which stand at 39% and 32%. In addition, he's still able to exploit the flexibility of the directive to devote the majority of his resources to the area bombing of German towns and cities. Many of these naturally contain targets related to the oil and chemical industry, and almost all have important rail junctions or marshalling yards. And the directive allows that attacks on important industrial areas may be carried out when oil or transport targets are impeded by poor weather or visibility. On the American side, the methods are not at all much different. The Americans do focus on major industrial and rail targets, but their accuracy is hardly better. In good visibility, some 80% of bombs land within 1 mile of the aiming point. But given this bombing takes place in autumn and winter, some 76% of bombing is done non-visually. In these conditions, the bombers are encouraged to simply attack any town visible with the aid of the H-2X bombing radar on the basis that most towns and cities are bound to contain some military vital targets. The two services dropped their highest bomb loads of the war in 1944, 525,518 tons for Bomber Command and 389,119 tons for the 8th Air Force. With German day and night fighters less of a threat than before, the death tolls climb. 2,000 dead at Freiburg on the night of November 27th, 7,000 at Heilbronn on December 4th, almost 1,800 dead at Nürnberg on January 2nd. The Luftwaffe makes a final attempt to seize back control of the skies with Operation Bodenplatte, which will take place on January 1st, 1945. The Luftwaffe scraped together 900 aircraft, in part by withdrawing forces from the Eastern Front, and launches a final assault to try to destroy the Allied air forces on the ground in France and the Low Countries. Sure, the Luftwaffe has some initial success, but the whole thing is representative of the situation by the end of the year. The German fighters are hobbled by low fuel supplies, are shot down by their own AA guns, and then picked off by their superior Allied counterparts. The Germans suffer their biggest single-day loss of pilots, almost 240 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. These men are irreplaceable. As General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland, will later write of Bodenplatte, "We sacrificed our last substance." With full control of the skies, the result of the bombing are becoming clearer every month and are halting Speer's production efforts. Despite all the drawbacks of accuracy, the sheer weight of the bombing and the focus on the transportation network does start to bring results. Especially important are attacks on the Ruhr. Raids beginning in October hit rail junctions, marshalling yards, and canals. The fighters and fighter bombers join in, strafing locomotives and wagons across Germany. Out of 250,000 goods wagons available, almost half are inoperable by late November. Total rail freight traffic falls by 46% from September 44 to January 45. The bombers also hit Germany's inland waterways, blocking the Mittelland Canal, the main route out of the Ruhr, for much of October and November. Because of this, the flow of coal out of the Ruhr to industrial zones falls dramatically from 2.2 million tons in September 44 to just 422,000 in December. Germany goes into its last winter of the war without adequate coal reserves, and there's already a one-third cut in electricity generation in October. The impact begins to bite in German industry. There's an 80% fall in production at Braun, Bovery and C, one of the Reich's main producers of electrical transformers at Mannheim-Ludwigshafen. Opel in Rüsselsheim and BMW in Munich both close early next year for lack of coal. It is this final bombing campaign that starts to bring about the destruction of the German war industry. If we extend Albert Speer's production graph out to the end of January 45, we see that the index of industrial production falls from its high of 330 in July 44 to just 227, erasing more than a year's worth of progress. Combined with the devastating lack of fuel which limits operational maneuver, this prevents any sort of resurgence. But this renewed campaign also brings a cataclysmic level of destruction to German cities, which I will continue to cover in the new year. Under this weight of bombs, some major German cities see 55 to 60% of dwellings destroyed, and about 7,500,000 people will be left homeless. Estimates on death toll vary considerably, but at least 300,000 German civilians will have been killed by Allied bombing by the end of the war. Some put that number as high as 600,000. All that while Germany is already in the noose, being squeezed in a giant pincer movement, and the Wehrmacht starved for fuel. Even without the bombing, isn't it only a matter of time before the pincers close? It leaves us with a set of troubling moral questions. Is retribution a valid reason to go after a civilian population? Do the military goals trump civilian life when we are fighting back an aggressor terror regime? Does a civilian population bear responsibility for the acts of their government and have, therefore, forfeit their inalienable right to life? These questions were answered with a tentative no in numerous treaties between 1899 and 1939, and after this war, the answer by all countries will be a unanimous no, and the laws of war and conflict will be tightened even further to prohibit these massacres. Yet, it will happen again and again. And in 2023, 79 years after these events, it seems that some of us, too many of us, think that the answer should be that some people do deserve to die, even if they have not actively been part of any war. That makes me sad. Never forget.